What are the top 5 books in philosophy of mind? Who better to ask than a philosopher who has specialized in this topic? Welcome to the Analytic Christian. I'm Jordan, and this is the channel that helps you explore Christian philosophy and theology. My guest is Dr. Brian Cutter. He's a professor of philosophy at the University of Notre Dame, and he is an expert when it comes to the philosophy of mind. Thank you so much for joining me again.
Happy to be here.
We've made a couple of previous videos actually on topics related to the philosophy of mind. We've talked about philosophical zombies and philosophical ghosts and idealism. People that are interested in this video will want to check those out. But in this video, I want to get your top 5 recommendations for books on the philosophy of mind for those who they've never looked into this topic, but they're looking for a place to start and they might be able to refer to this video. So first, can you just say what is the philosophy of mind?
Sure, just a quick one or two sentence definition. So, philosophy of mind is the branch of philosophy that deals with fundamental questions about the nature of the mind and how it fits into the cosmic scheme. What's the relationship between mind and matter? How does mind fit into the rest of nature?
Cool. That already makes me interested. All right, now we'll just go through these books one at a time and let you say a little bit about each one. What's the first book that you would recommend?
Good. So, I'll start with what's maybe my very favorite book on the philosophy of mind, certainly the one that's had the biggest impact on my own philosophical thinking. And that's a book called The Conscious Mind by David Chalmers, written in 1996. In my view, I think The Conscious Mind is probably the single best work in philosophy of mind written in the last 50 years or so. And the nice thing about The Conscious Mind is it's mostly accessible to non-specialists. There are a few parts in it, and actually, if you look at the table of contents, I think there's stars next to the sections that are a little bit more difficult. But for most of the main stuff in that book is pretty accessible to a non-specialist. I mean, it's going to take a bit of work, but I think you could understand it. So the basic goal of the book, there's kind of two parts. The first part is to argue against materialist views of consciousness. So that's kind of the negative part, and in favor of a kind of dualist to property dualist conception of consciousness. And then the second, so the subtitle of the book is Towards a Science of Consciousness. So once we've ruled out materialist views of consciousness, he thinks we can still kind of embark on the project and trying to give a scientific explanation of consciousness. It's not going to be a reductive explanation, reducing consciousness to underlying physical states. We're going to take consciousness as fundamental, but we can still look for the basic laws of nature that connect physical states to states of consciousness. And so, what he does in the book is give some speculative proposals first for some non fundamental laws of nature connecting physical states of the brain to states of consciousness, and then give some more speculative proposals for what the most fundamental connecting laws might be. Along the way, there's some interesting discussions of how consciousness connects with issues in quantum mechanics, questions about whether a machine could be conscious. A lot of good discussion along the way about a wide range of issues on the philosophy of consciousness.
That sounds
So
great.
that's my first book recommendation. And I guess if you're only going to read one of these, that's kind of my big go-to recommendation for most people who are getting started in the philosophy of mind. Go on to a few others. So, second book in the philosophy of mind that I really like is a recent book written a couple of years ago by my one of my PhD advisors, Adam Pautz. That's Pautz. He's got a nice book called Perception, and it's meant to be a kind of general introductory overview to philosophical theories of perception. And it's written for a kind of like advanced undergraduate level. So I've taught it to my majors level philosophy of mind classes, and that's gone really well. And basically, the setup of the book is to look through and examine the four main philosophical views about the nature of perception, kind of the nature of our perceptual access to reality. Along the way, he addresses a number of really interesting and vexing and puzzling questions about the nature of perception, such as, do we directly perceive things in the external world, or do we only indirectly perceive the world via kind of internal mental images? Also, questions about the extent to which the world of appearance matches up to reality. Like, to what extent are the qualities and properties presented to us in perceptual experience really out there in the world? To what extent are they products of the mind? So it's a really nice, accessible overview of kind of the main philosophical positions on how to think about perception, how perception acquaints us with reality. So that's my second suggestion. A third book I really like on the philosophy of mind, it's a little bit older, from the 1920s, called it's called The Mind and Its Place in Nature by C.D. Broad. This is, well, the title is pretty self-explanatory, so it's a very broad-ranging exploration of how the mind fits into nature. What's the relationship between mind and the rest of nature? And it goes through a lot of the same issues that David Chalmers goes through in that first book I recommended, but it's a little bit more wide ranging in that it's not just focused narrowly on consciousness or qualia, but it's trying to understand all of the different facets and aspects of the mind and how mind relates to the biological realm, to the chemical level, to the physical level. And one nice thing about this book is it connects issues in philosophy of mind to just general metaphysical questions about the general structure of reality. And it's he doesn't come down with a lot of hard and fast opinions on the key questions. I mean, he does weigh in occasionally and he inclines towards certain views and he lets readers know his leanings on various issues. But it's just a nice book for a very wide ranging systematic survey of kind of the space of possibilities when it comes to thinking about the nature of the mind. And it's at once very rigorous, but also pretty accessible.
And even though was written in the 1920s, it's still a good place to look today.
Oh, yeah. I mean, definitely. Less so on some issues than others, but I think the key I mean, so there are some scientific issues. We know more about how the brain works now than we did in the 1920s. But the main kind of philosophically relevant empirical facts about correlation between brain activity and mental activity, the kinds of scientific facts that you need to get the interesting philosophical puzzles and questions and arguments off the ground, he was already well aware of most of those. And so I think the discussion holds up pretty well with maybe a few exceptions here or there. Okay, so a fourth book I'll recommend. So this will be kind of more of a pro-materialist book. The three that I've mentioned so far tend to push kind of away from the materialist orthodoxy. But in the second half of the 20th century, materialist views of the mind were kind of the dominant, most orthodox way of thinking about the mind within philosophy. And here, I think the single best book defending a materialist conception of the mind is David Armstrong's book from 1968 called A Materialist Theory of the Mind. So, what David Armstrong does in this book is he defends materialism by way of a view that's called functionalism. The basic idea here is that our mental concepts are functional concepts. So, our concept of pain, for example, is just the concept of a state that plays a certain causal role. Or maybe it's typically caused by bodily injury and typically causes so and so behavior. Or a concept of an intention to do such and such is the concept of a state that typically causes such and such behavior, among other things. And so the thought is if we can analyze mental concepts in terms of the causal roles they play, then we might just find out empirically that the states that play those roles are physical states of the brain, thereby vindicating a kind of materialism, not as an a priori truth about the mind, but as a kind of empirical discovery about the nature of the mind. So, if anyone wants a kind of what I think of as the best book length defense of materialism about the mind, that would be my go to book. Okay, so the fifth book that I'll recommend, this is a more recent book. It's called Consciousness and Fundamental Reality. It's a book by the philosopher Philip Goff, who I know you've had on the channel before. I think I had a debate slash discussion with him several months ago. So this is his book length defense of Russellian panpsychism. And I think it's probably the best, most rigorously argued book length defense of that view. So panpsychism the view that consciousness is ubiquitous in the physical universe, that it belongs to the fundamental physical entities. And he develops it as a version of Russellian monism. The basic idea here is that physical sciences only tell us the kind of abstract relational structure of reality, but they don't tell us kind of the intrinsic nature of matter. It tells us how matter is related to other matter, but not what matter is like in its. And the Russellian idea, or at least the Russellian panpsychist idea, is that intrinsic nature of matter has something to do with consciousness or somehow realized by conscious experience. So if people are interested in panpsychism and Russellian monist views of consciousness, I think the best book to look at there would be Philip Goff's book, Consciousness and Fundamental Reality.
All right. Well, thank you so much for giving us that top 5 list, and I'll put links to each book in the description of this video, so if one of those sounded interesting to you, then you can just click there. And before you go, you already brought it up, Dr. Cutter, but check out that discussion that Dr. Cutter had with Philip Goff on what best explains consciousness, theism, or panpsychism.